We'll next hear from Chris Bright, the Director of Public Training for the Trevor Project, to learn more about suicide prevention efforts for LGBTQ youth. The Trevor Project is the nation's leading organization that serves LGBTQ youth in the areas of suicide prevention and crisis intervention. They've recently really invested in a digital transformation to better serve young people, recently announcing that all 3 of their crisis service programs are available 24/7. Chris develops and oversees their internal crisis services trainings, as well as trainings and workshops throughout the country, and we're so pleased that Chris is with us today to share more about this work.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I am here in not so sunny California today, and thank you for welcoming me. My name is Chris Bright. I am the Director of Public Training here at the Trevor Project. In terms of pronouns, I use the pronouns he, she, or they interchangeably. We won't have much time to chat about pronouns today, but it's certainly an important part of supporting LGBTQ youth, so I wanted to mention that. All right, so just real quick, I wanted to review some of the crisis services we offer at Trevor because this is a very important piece of the work that we do here. We are sort of first and foremost a crisis intervention and suicide prevention organization. The Trevor Lifeline is our sort of phone-focused crisis intervention service. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you'll see the number there, 866-488-7386. It's good to have that in your phone or ready to offer someone if they ever need support. We're also very excited that we recently have acquired this particular short code for our text services, which is 678678, nice and easy to remember. And as was mentioned in the sort of sharing out of my bio, we are very excited because Trevor has very recently gone 24/7 across all of our crisis intervention services. So not just a 24/7 lifeline, but also a 24/7 text and chat service. We have something called Trevor Space, which I'm going to give you a little bit more info on in just a second. And we are also a place where people can get suicide prevention and general info on supporting LGBTQ youth at our website, thetrevorproject.org. So this right here, Trevor Space, I wanted to just sort of throw out there that this is a really cool peer-to-peer resource. It's a social network, not unlike Facebook, for example, where young people can post and share things that are going on in their life, connect with other young people who maybe have a similar identity to them or a similar understanding of the world. And that's really exciting because a lot of times people geographically within the LGBT community are locked in spaces away from one another, and they don't necessarily get to see themselves reflected in the world around them or the peers that they have. And so this resource is another really cool place that you might be able to point an LGBTQ person towards, particularly a young person, because this service is moderated and only available for people under the age of 25. All right. So some interesting facts in terms of the types of topics and things that come up on our services. So the number one sort of thing on the Lifeline and for our chat and text services is sort of a broad category of like mental health concerns or mental health problems that might arise. But number two, in terms of the Lifeline, is focused more on relationships, whereas number two on digital is more around issues of coming out. On the Lifeline, we also see that number three is shared between both, and that's conversations around gender identity that come up very frequently. The number four on Lifeline, coming out, and number five on digital being relationships, so there's a bit of a swap there in those categories. And then number five on the Lifeline would be family, things maybe like family rejection or lack of support from family. And on our digital services, it would be self-injury. These topics come up really broadly, and it's interesting because for a lot of folks, when they think about suicide prevention, they don't think about, for example, the coming out process for an LGBTQ person, or they don't think about gender identity, or necessarily about relationships or family rejection, right? Oftentimes, suicide prevention is linked more around one's mental health. And so it's something that I want to highlight for you because it's definitely connected to the work that we do really intimately. I want to talk a little bit about some statistics to help you understand why the LGBT community comes up so often in conversations around suicide prevention. So, and really, I would say suicide prevention and crisis intervention in general. So if we talk about homelessness from the perspective of a crisis intervention, a 2018 study found that LGBTQs are 2.2 times greater risk for homelessness than their heterosexual or cisgender peers. A 2015 study found that 44% of LGBTQ homeless youth are of color or Latinx. In terms of sexual assault, a 2017 national survey of students found that 7.9% of heterosexual high school students had experienced sexual violence compared to 38.7% of their LGBTQ peers. Whenever we see disparities like that between the general population, that raises a great big red flag for us. A 2017 national survey found that sexual violence had taken place one or more times in the 12 months prior to the survey for 31.4% of transgender youth. Again, a big red flag because when you compare that to cisgender youth, it's a 9.8%, so a big disparity there as well. If we shift towards issues of assault, in a 2017 national study, 12.4% of LGBTQ students were physically assaulted, kicked, pushed, injured with a weapon in the past year based on sexual orientation, 11.2% on gender expression, and 10% based on gender in general. A 2017 national study that shows that 59.5% of LGBTQ students felt unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation, 44.6% because of their gender expression, and 35% because of their gender. And then finally, intimate partner violence. A 2017 national study, 5.5% of heterosexual students versus 15.8% of gay, lesbian, and bisexual, and 14.1% of questioning students reported experiencing dating violence, which is something that comes up with this population in particular. A 2017 survey found that 56.6% of students reported hearing homophobic remarks from their teachers or other school staff, and 71% of students reported hearing negative remarks about their gender from teachers or school staff. That same survey found that 87.4% of LGBTQ students heard negative remarks specifically about transgender people. Examples using words like tranny or he, she, and 45.6% heard them often or frequently. So I know statistics are dry, so thanks for going on that journey with me. But let's look at sort of where this leads us. This leads us to the fact that all of these things combined increase this particular population's risk for suicidal ideation. And when these things sort of push a LGBTQ young person in this direction, we see sort of that huge disparity from the general population sort of across any member of the LGBT community. LGBTQ youth suicide statistics. So you'll see that in this case, if you just sort of read across the chart, trans youth, LGB youth, questioning youth, and heterosexual youth, you have 44% contemplating suicide, 35% attempting suicide, and 17% resulting in injury, poisoning, or overdose for trans youth. In the general category of LGB, you have 48 versus 23 versus 8. And if you just continue to sort of read across, you'll see that when you compare this to sort of a general population, let's say, of heterosexual youth, the number is much smaller, 13% contemplated, 5% attempting, or 2% resulting in injury, poisoning, and overdose. So these things affect our community. And in fact, one thing that we notice within the suicide prevention community in general is that members of minority groups or members of groups that are often pushed to the margins of society are more likely to experience suicidal ideation, attempts of suicide, and suicide resulting in injury, poisoning, or overdose. And that's why you often find organizations like Trevor whose mission it is to serve, a specific population that sort of has been pushed to the margins of society. So let's quickly talk about some best practices. One thing that I want to highlight for you all is that a study shows that one supportive person can decrease an LGBTQ risk for suicide by 30%. So someone who is open and affirming of all LGBTQ identities, being exposed to, particularly for a young person, being exposed to an adult who has that sort of affirming stance, is absolutely imperative to the sort of health and well-being of young people, and in fact can decrease the risk of suicide by 30%. Now, let's talk some best practices related to identity, things that help. One thing that helps is mirroring language and using the correct pronouns for the caller. So, for example, if somebody uses the pronouns she, her, and her, and the name that they go by is Michelle, but their parents are constantly calling them Michael and using he, him, his pronouns, and then when they go to school, their teachers are constantly calling her Michael and using he, him, his pronouns. She might feel isolated and alone, and like nobody out there supports her or cares about her identity or her perspective in the world. And so it's absolutely imperative that as a step forward and a step towards affirming young people or anybody within the LGBT community, that we mirror language. If they say that they want to use she, her, hers pronouns, if they say that they identify as transgender, or they say that they are gay or lesbian or bisexual or anywhere on that spectrum, if those sorts of things come up, mirroring the language and affirming those identities, we know is a huge protective factor when it comes to reducing risk for suicide. We also want to normalize the exploration of gender identity and sexual orientation. The reality is young people aren't always sure exactly how they want to identify or where they're coming from, and so that's an important piece here. Exploring opportunities to expand affirming experiences. So, for example, in your workplace, in your office, in your sort of public life, are there access to gender-neutral restrooms? Is there safe access to maybe LGBT supportive or affirming groups on campus? Or are there trainings that might be available in your community that you could push to have in your police departments, fire departments, hospitals, maybe your place of work, all in an effort to expand affirming experiences. Also, please be aware of your own impulses and reactions. If you find that maybe you're not completely comfortable with a particular identity or a particular perspective, it's important to challenge that, because oftentimes those discomforts come across in sort of life or death situations where a young person feels judged, an LGBTQ person feels isolated because they can't find someone who affirms them. So what does not help? Well, asking questions simply out of curiosity is not particularly helpful. So just because you don't maybe understand or you're curious about a certain thing, that can make someone feel sort of like an oddity, or make someone feel sort of like, they're this curious, that you're just sort of exploring their identity because you find it fascinating as opposed to finding it valid. It also doesn't help if you're sort of discouraging or moving away from the topic of transition or sex. Young people oftentimes struggle to find any adults who are willing to give them accurate or supportive information around these identities. And so if you discourage or move away from those conversations, it can often lead to increased feelings of isolation. And certainly you wouldn't want to invalidate a youth's experience based on their age. This whole notion that young people can't make decisions for themselves has also led to a great deal of sort of fear and anxiety and isolation, because young people are not being empowered to own their truth and to own their identities. Now, in terms of coming out, it's always good to explore the both sides of the coin on this one, so the benefits and the risks of coming out. Because the reality is you couldn't just say to somebody, you should come out or you shouldn't come out. It's a very personal decision, and there are benefits and risks in this decision. There are places in the country where young people will lose their jobs, or anybody will lose their jobs because of their identity. Same thing with certain school systems that might have policies or procedures that are enacted against LGBTQ folks who are out or trying to be open about their identity. But being out and open about your identity might also open you up to a world of support and a world of affirmation. And so exploring both the risks and the benefits with someone is actually a very beneficial sort of thought exercise when someone's thinking through the process of coming out. Oftentimes we might find ourselves saying, you know, have your parents ever said anything negative or positive that would give you a hint at how they might feel about LGBTQ folks? Or, you know, have you ever noticed if your school has any safe or open and affirming spaces like a GSA or gender neutral restrooms, things like that, to sort of get the person thinking through the possibilities. Engaging callers in the setting, timing, and their post-disclosure self-care is important. So if it goes well, what will you do? If it doesn't go well, how might you respond? You know, do you need to line up some Netflix and a bubble bath? Or do you need to go for a run or play with your dog or, you know, eat some pizza? Things that sort of help people process how things might go. Normalizing the stress and courage it takes to come out is important because this isn't easy. Identifying opportunities to expand support, either virtual or in person. There are places in the country where young people are hundreds of miles away from open and affirming resources, and so sometimes you have to go that virtual route. What does not help would be weighing in on whether the caller should or shouldn't come out. It's not your decision to make for them, rather it's a decision that they make for themselves. So these are some references. I'm just about at time, and I know we have a question section coming up, so I'll just sort of quickly go through the references, but they're there in case you need them. And then there's my contact information. I'm happy for anyone to reach out if they have any questions that we're not able to get to throughout the session. Thanks so much for your time, everyone. I know that was sort of a whirlwind of a topic covering. We could spend many, many days talking about supporting LGBTQ identities. But for now, I'll take the 15 minutes and run with it.